if we could, even right now, plant that seed of how important silence is, I will say potentially for the next level of our own evolution. And maybe that's becoming more and more clear to people as the dissonance and the incoherence become louder and louder and louder. It's like this cacophony of noise at this point. And right, that's the key to remote viewing. You gotta sort the signal from the noise. And yeah, so maybe we'll just plant a seed in this conversation that the primacy of silence, because from there you can start to hear the signals and get drawn to alignment with the authentic self, if you will, if I could use that term. And yeah, I think our culture is screaming for it, right? Really, like through the noise, it's screaming, or through the mental health crisis, it's screaming, or the opioid crisis. The political discord. You can point to it almost at every turn.
Welcome to the Rational Mystic Podcast. I'm your host, James Webb, and today I'm very happy to share with you my recent conversation with Dr. Leanne Whitney. Dr. Whitney is an author and a scholar. She is a Jungian psychologist and a longtime yoga practitioner, as well as a coach with a focus on personal transformation. And in these set of conversations, that diverse background, that extensive knowledge comes to bear on the concept of psycho-spiritual systems and how we can, in the West, adopt and adapt many of the yogic practices and yoga core philosophy, particularly as are articulated by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, into our own lives, both to better ourselves, but also our families and our communities, and more broadly speaking and optimistically, the world. So I found Dr. Whitney to be an exceptionally wise human being, such a warm personality, and someone so willing to share information freely. And so I really enjoyed these conversations, and I hope you all do as well. Leanne, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you joining me and have an opportunity to speak to you about your work and your experiences. I have to say, I was talking to you a little bit before we hit the record button, but you wrote this most amazing book. As I started to kind of find my own path, you come across books that really speak to you and feel important. And you had a book that you wrote, I think it was your doctoral dissertation about consciousness in Patanjali and with Jung. And I think that in looking at that book, you have kind of a very narrow section where you begin to start talking about your own experiences and what led you to begin that book and to start your own journey. And I think it's just a few paragraphs, but I know the experience, if you unfold it, is probably a lot longer. But I think you talked in that in the book about having what you termed as a pure consciousness experience. And is that kind of what started you down this road with your scholarship?
It absolutely was, yes. In the religious studies literature, it's called a pure consciousness event. It was literally about a fraction of a second, or very, very short period of time. I had just finished practicing yoga. I had been in a yoga class, and my awareness went into this non-dual state of what I term pure consciousness, and then what I subsequently realized was called a pure consciousness event, where basically everything is reality. Reality is pure consciousness, and that's the reality of being, and knowledge is structured in it. And from there, I didn't really know how to process it, because from a dualistic mindset, or the Euro-American culture that I grew up in, pure consciousness had never understood even that idea. And I came from Catholicism was my background. So I had very dualistic ideas, basically dualistic religious ideas, dualistic scientific ideas. So consciousness is all there is, and knowledge is structured in it is not something that I could really put into any framework that I knew. But luckily, again, I was in a yoga room at the time of the event, and from there, I discovered the Tibetan Book of the Dead and Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and the Orthodox and non-Orthodox Hindu system of thought gave me a context. Thankfully, those Indian systems of thought gave me a context within which to start to begin to process and understand on a deeper level. And boy, it's been 20 plus years at this point, and what a journey it's been. So
there's not a journey in a straight line either, right? It's a journey. It's a curved road. Now, when you had that experience, I think maybe you alluded to in the book that you didn't even know perhaps that those kind of experiences, like a unitive experience, was a thing, that you were just beginning to start some of your yoga practice. How long had you been doing yoga, and was that something you were seeking, or just kind of come, just out of sight suddenly into your world?
Oh yeah, I hadn't studied the philosophy or the psychology or anything, so that's why I didn't have the context for it. I wasn't seeking it in any way. I had gone through a bit of a health crisis actually in the mid 90s, and it was around 98 when I began practicing yoga. Back in those days, we had DVDs, and I remember picking one up at a Whole Foods market in Boston. And then I was also living in New York a little bit, and there was a studio called Jivamukti not very far from where I was living. So I showed up for healing, basically. I didn't feel good, and I saw these DVDs at Whole Foods. I think also a healing practitioner had said, oh, you should try yoga and breathing practices. So that's how I started to get into it, to feel better. And then I had this event in this yoga room. That was in July of 2000. So sporadically between 98 and 2000, I practiced. Come 2000, actually I had a dedicated 6-day-a-week practice. But still, I'd never been exposed in any way to the philosophical or psychological underpinnings of the yoga tradition. And, here in the States, a lot of times we teach the asana as if the asana almost was like the totality, when really it's one limb of a very deep and profound system of thought. So, yeah, I hadn't yet been exposed to it, but certainly did after that event.
I think you touched upon an important point for a lot of folks who may not be familiar with the depth of yoga philosophy. So when you speak about yoga, you're using it in a very different term sometimes than maybe many people encounter it if you look at it commercially with some of the offerings that are out there. So when you look at yoga and some of the practices and the intersection point with the underlying philosophy of yoga, you're talking about a much broader totality. And I have to say, reading your book, I read a little bit, but understanding the complexity, I think you talk about yoga as a real science and looking at the complexity of some of the concepts, the intersection of the concepts. So is that something you could elaborate a little bit on?
Sure. First of all, yoga is the philosophy of union, philosophy of integration. And it's, thousands of years old. It predates even the Buddha and some of the Pali canon. There's some texts that say the Buddha was a yogi. So these are practices that have been around for thousands of years. In India, the term is rishis for the seers. They wrote the Rig Veda. And again, nobody signed their name to it. That's also, for me, very profound about those texts, is that there's no name. And everybody knew better, I should say, than to sort of hang on with their ego and claim to this knowledge that, as I'm saying, it's structured in consciousness. So to take ownership of it actually starts to occlude your capacity to even be present in it or to it, or perhaps we could say speak for it or speak within it. So yes, yoga as a totality is the philosophy of union, the philosophy of integration. The asanas are an amazing limb and aspect of the practice to get on our yoga mat and to breathe and to link our breath with our movements and to still the mind and to open up the channels of the body really prepares us to receive this totality and this unity. So the asanas are really strong, as is. There's actually nothing in the yoga tradition ultimately that's superfluous. It's all a really tightly knit, woven mental, emotional, physical, spiritual system of thought. So the asanas definitely hold an important place, but it must be kept within the whole system. If you try to just pull it out, it becomes calisthenics, and it really is no longer relatable to its home base.
So you have this unitive experience, and the temptation, I think, when people hear about this is we go, what was it really like? And I think that's you talking about some of the experiences you had. You can kind of describe them, but it's not exactly, of course, the same thing as experiencing it, being in that moment. But from that, had you studied psychology at that point in your academic career? Was that something that was already kind of in your background and your the way you were thinking about things, or was that something that kind of followed for you after having this unitive experience?
Oh, it followed after. So in July of 2000, I was in the middle of making my first documentary called The Fire Within, about a long-term AIDS survivor. I was right in the middle of production of that, of still filming it. And as I edited that film and put it together, I decided that I was going to make my next film on the evolution of human consciousness. And I went about filming that. I had interviews with Gary Zukav, author of Seed of the Soul, Jeff Mishlove, host of New Thinking Aloud, an author of PK Man, Russell Targ, legacy in the field of remote viewing and psychic phenomena. So yeah, I went about interviewing people. I went to Egypt and Peru and filmed in various spiritual sites. But I found in the editing phase, I really couldn't put it together. Like I couldn't get to the third act. And that's what led me into the academy and to start investigating consciousness. Actually, it was Jeff Mishlove who said to me, boy, you are taking on a massive topic to try to make a film about the evolution of human consciousness. But I was a bit of a novice at that point. But that's what sent me into the academy to then do research and really ground myself into, like yoga. This kind of work is both a science and an art, actually, because you said the science of yoga. Well, it's not really science as a lot of Euro-Americans would consider science, with this hard objective, demarcation between the subject and object. Yoga science is radically empirical. It's about the involution of thought forms. So you are at one with this idea, this reality of pure consciousness, but it's pure awareness. So then the phenomena, if you will, take on, I don't want to say a different state, but a different tone or texture or, radical objective reality. It can be seen to have its place, but then it's also put into a context of a much larger, where that cut lies. And that's where quantum physics sort of comes in and tries to articulate the language for, we don't even know where the cut lies between the subject and the object. So yoga science is very, very well aware of that, whereas we're kind of still struggling, right, to put classical physics and quantum physics in dialogue with each other. So anyway, the academy sort of, brought me down all those rabbit holes and looking into so many different systems of thought, but mostly psychology is.
I love your book, but knowing that you had started that documentary, it's like, okay, we got to get our energy. That's an amazing that you had done that. So, well, I know in your book and in some of your work that you articulated there, you really get a sense. So talking about depth psychology and talking about Jung, and your book it runs from talking about quantum physics and the holographic universe to really bridging these ideas about depth psychology and Jungian's idea of self with these ancient traditions of Patanjali. So it's kind of hard. Your scholarship across this book to me was just incredibly impressive. And I think I share with you from the beginning all of the Sanskrit terms that you use and that you know. I'll mispronounce every single one of them. So if there's any philologists, see if you pronounce that, you look at this. I'm going to try that. But look, your motivation for, seems like you had felt that, and in your book, I know you touch upon what seems to be, in your perception, that some areas where Jung, from his own cultural upbringing, you talk about lenses and the perception that Jung inherited in kind of a Victorian era and that time period. And then how maybe some of his own fear had played into that. And so it really seems in your book that you're trying to look at this really critical bridge to try to bring together these ancient traditions, our scientific approach that we have right now, with really, I think you call them psycho-spiritual systems, but you're trying to look at this integrative approach. So it seems like, I know you talked about the documentary being a massive undertaking, but I really look at your book as this really, it's incredibly impressive to me, the scope and scale of what you seem to be trying to achieve with that. So did I get that right? Is that kind of, I know it's hard to summarize things in broad brushstrokes, but when you looked at this experience and your motivation for bringing together the book, what was in the back of your mind? What were you thinking about?
Oh, I love that you use the term critical bridge. Well, when I was in the academy itself is what prompted the seed for the book. So here I am again. If we predate the academy, and I'm trying to make this movie, and I don't know how to make the third act, and you know, I go down this rabbit hole, if you will. There's hornet's nest of these arguments in the field of consciousness studies, because it's being approached from so many different points of view, or through the lens of so many different disciplines. And Jung was, we're talking about Carl Jung here, Swiss psychologist. He was one of the original pioneers way back in, what was it, 1925, 1930, reading the texts as those initial translations were coming out of India, out of China. And he said, there's something here, like, we have to look at this, basically. And so he did his best to look at these texts, but in many ways, he used he definitely used his framework. I mean, really, as we all do, but he psychologized the texts in some ways, and sort of forced them to fit into his psychology as he was seeing it. And look, I love Jung, and I revere the tradition, and I'm happy to be part of the depth psychological tradition. But I think it's we must be critical of where things break down within the tradition. And so I've tried to do that. Not to much success, I must say, because people tend to want to elevate Jung as the master. And at this point, I mean, I find it to be really constricting. So it's also, if you can even hear it in the way that I try to articulate it, because it's not that I chose him because I revered him. After I had that pure consciousness event in 2000, my best friend actually had given me Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which was Jung's autobiography, where he was clearly having deep spiritual experiences. So as I was trying to digest my experience, and I was so grateful to come into the yoga philosophy and the yoga text, and I was reading Jung simultaneously. Like, I was reading the back. I love your hand gesture. Yeah, I'd pick up a volume of the collected works, and then I'd read the Yoga Sutras again, and I'd pick up a volume of the collected works and read the Yoga Sutras again. And at some point, after years, I was like, whoa, what Jung thinks is that his self equates to the Atman of the yoga tradition. It doesn't map, because pure consciousness is the reality of being. It's the ontological primitive, as it's often said. It's and again, the knowledge is structured in it, whereas Jung's psychology resolves to human beings bringing light to mere being, human beings bringing knowledge to God. So Jung's unconscious is real, ontologically real, and that absolutely does not equate to what the Orthodox Indian tradition is teaching the world. They're saying, no, consciousness is all there is. Like that is what everything is existing within. That is reality. That is a closed system, so to speak. Not that there isn't free will within it, right? Not to say that everything's determined, but it ontologically is determined by itself. And Jung didn't speak to that. For him, human beings were bringing consciousness to God.
So I know that I think you pointed this out just beautifully in your book, but you talk about the Yoga Sutras themselves and Patanjali's work. I think you talk about in the second sutra, I mean, it's being succinct about anything is masterful. And so I think you talk about, in the second sutra, Patanjali basically lays out almost the entire edifice of his philosophical framework. And then we have a series of sutras that proceed from there. But for those who aren't familiar with at least some of the fundamental aspects when we talk about universal consciousness, and I think you really touch a lot upon some conceptions of both authenticity and alignment. And also, I know what we contemporarily we call healing processes. But when you look at some of the, I don't know how far you want to dive into this, because I know a little bit of the depth of scholarship from your work. But for those who aren't familiar with that frame, when we talk about contrasting that with maybe Jung's approach, what would be your way of trying to help them orient a little bit?
Great question. So pure consciousness, the reality of being, if we look at the purity of that, it's where let's just say here at the plane of all possibilities, right? So it's just pure consciousness, anything's possible. All possibilities are here. And then we clearly, as human beings, we have a mental world, and we start to take the contents of consciousness, right? The phenomena, the thoughts, the emotions, the objects out there, and we start to build systems of thought. So here's the plane of possibilities, and then you've got a silo starting to be constructed around your perceptions, but what you start to conceive that to be. So like Jung saying human beings are bringing, light into mere being, or into the darkness of mere being, or bringing, consciousness to God. It's because he's got them constructing the thought, constructing the knowledge, building the libraries. We're going to figure it out. It's very cognitive. It's very linguistic. So
I think you referred to that as kind of like an egoic knowledge at one point, was maybe a term that you had used.
You could say that, because you're hanging on to it. This is what I was trying to allude to earlier with Shruti, or the Rishi, the seers, and their intuitive perception of knowledge, and they're not signing their name to it, because ultimately they're like, well, who's going to take ownership of this? This is knowledge that's coming through intuitively, so I can't take ownership because it's not mine. Whereas, right, all our library books and everybody's like, and again, that even happens within the Jungian framework to begin with. And that's why Jung gets built up as the master. So any system like that really gets built up and constructed, and you hold on to your identity. And but again, to always to come back to make sure I balance that out. Jung was known for saying, "I'm so glad I'm young and not a Jungian," because he could already see what was going to probably happen. Post, him disincarnating. So, I hope I'm answering you. So it's the plane of possibilities, and then we build up these silos, and we hang on to these particular systems of thought. Whereas what Patanjali is saying, and in that second Yoga Sutra, he says, and we can leave the Sanskrit aside. He says yoga is the stilling of the modifications of the mind. So again, with the mentation and the modification, you're building up this silo. And Patanjali is saying, well, because really the Yoga Sutras are written to instruct a way of salvation from suffering. it's really pointed, hey, yoga is union. It's the philosophy of integration. So what Patanjali is teaching, he's not teaching the masters, he's teaching people who are out of that flow of integration. Somehow they've, as we would say in interpersonal neurobiology, they've banked up on the side. If the river of integration is here, you bank up on rigidity or chaos. And that's how Patanjali is speaking to those people who are banked up on rigidity or chaos, who are in patterns of suffering. So he's like, okay, you're a pattern of suffering. It means you must be up here in a silo, that you're not down here with pure consciousness and this pure awareness, this seeing that sees the contents, the seeing that sees the scene, right? If we take the seer and the seen, or just pure seeing. And so he says, still what you've got twirling around as this pattern of thought, if you can still that, involute it and take it right back down to the plane of possibilities, now you're at the seer. Now you're not in the scene. You're not wound up in these contents. You're here with the seer. And that's what's amazing about that system of thought. And I do understand that faith is an important part of following the path. Like, you have to have trust that what Patanjali is saying plays out, really, because you deconstruct all that. And what he's saying is, you don't go into a void of nothingness. Now you're going to be aligned with your true nature. Now you're going to be relaxed. You're going to take a seat beyond the dualities. You're going to take a comfortable seat in your body. Your breath and your mind are going to be linked. And that's the beauty of stilling. He's saying, still the mind. Silence is okay. Silence is your friend. And silence, and this is what's so genius about the unity and how yoga brings this to light, is, we can only take a comfortable seat when that fear has resolved. We're not afraid anymore. We can, you can breathe. Your system is flowing. You can get breath down into your gut, into your lungs. And then, because fear is doing nothing but throwing interference patterns between us and our experience of the world, which I'm sure your remote viewing teachings.
I'd love to ask you some questions about that, of course. Your book touched on a lot of the elements, I guess, the salvation elements and the commonality. Of course, the cities are a whole other interesting conversation, and how they're oriented. But I want to go back to what you just talked about, because there's so much to unpack, and there's so much wisdom in that. But you talk a lot in your text about Patanjali's methodologies and thought process, and you call it the involution of thought, like taking thought back to its source. And so when you talk about that, what do you mean in terms of practice or actual structure around that Patanjali would be speaking to for us?
Well, definitely breath work, I would say, is key, and especially for people in like Euro-American culture. Because what the breath work does, and that's pranayama, that's the Sanskrit term, and that's one of the limbs, one of Patanjali's 8 limbs is that pranayama. Those breath work practices are primary, because a lot of people sit and they try to meditate, and then they're like, oh, my mind is like, all over the place, and oh my God, I can't meditate. And you do want to make sure that you have what we call good vagal tone, in particular, the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve. It's such an important, it runs from the cranium all to around our heart and all the way down to our gut. You want to make sure that the vagus nerve and the nadis, the nerves in the body, have good tone, and the breath work brings that about. And that brings a level of comfort to taking a seat in order to sit and meditate. And oh boy, Patanjali gives so many suggestions, and one of them being even pick your own thing. Like here, I'm going to give you, like, he teaches people to focus on Ishvara, which is the term basically for, almost like you could call it like a personal God, or Jung. It's very similar to Jung's archetype In some ways, there's some similarities there. Basically, it's the teacher that's taught all the ancient teachers, even the Buddhas. So it's basically focusing on Ishvara, but you pick a focal point and you meditate on that point, and so you calm. What chitta-vritti is the term in Sanskrit, but and I often like to say it this way. So if this is if this is pure consciousness sitting in its true nature, here's the mind going off wildly, and so through the concentration and the meditation and the absorption, you start to still those fluctuations. And so if they're out here around a different system of thought, through the stilling, they come and they get absorbed back into that out of which they arose, which is pure consciousness.
And I can cheat a little bit, because when you pronounce things, that I can try to emulate you and sound like I know how to pronounce them. But when you talk about, is it Verities? Is that how you?
Verities. Mm-hmm.
You almost have this idea of these discursive, the narrative thought, the constant discursive thought you sometimes have. And in that stilling process, what it reminded me of looking at your work is when we talk about, I've had several folks on to talk about psychic work. And one of the key aspects for doing any kind of psychic work is that stilling. It's this very different process, very different mindset, where you start to learn very early on that whether or not someone told that you're meditating, but you realize that your ability to engage some of these psychic abilities or psi abilities, or however we want to articulate them, is very dependent on that quality of consciousness and a certain kind of feeling. And it's hard sometimes to articulate that feeling. So when I was reading and you were talking about that aspect of sort of the stilling of the Verities, it really made me think about what that means. When I first came across this, it was amazing to me just by what is the benefit of calming one's mind? And I don't think people quite realize how incredibly powerful just the fundamental skill of a very basic thing of being able to calm your mind is.
100%. I mean, our culture doesn't really encourage it. I mean, even if you look at over the course of my lifetime, the amount of TV channels, the amount of media, the podcasts, YouTube. I mean, here we are recording something on YouTube. But yeah, our mind is, and that could speak to the mental health crisis. Our minds are fractured. The attention economy, we call it now. People's minds are going in almost dozens of directions all at one time. If we could, even right now, plant that seed of how important silence is, I will say potentially for the next level of our own evolution. And maybe that's becoming more and more clear to people as the dissonance and the incoherence become louder and louder and louder. It's like this cacophony of noise at this point. And that's the key to remote viewing. You gotta sort the signal from the noise. And yeah, so maybe we'll just plant a seed in this conversation that the primacy of silence, because from there you can start to hear the signals and get drawn to alignment with the authentic self, if you will, if I could use that term. And yeah, I think our culture is screaming for it, right? Really, like through the noise, it's screaming, or through the mental health crisis, it's screaming, or the opioid crisis. The political discord. You can point to it almost at every turn.
Yeah, I think in your book you talk about the commonality of these symptoms of pain and suffering that both Jung and Patañjali speak about. So disruption in breathing, feeling emotional anguish, all these I think you call them red flags, that they're red flags, something going on that you need to be paying attention to. And sometimes people might see these things emerge, or these feelings, and not really even understand what the origin point of that is at all. But you extrapolate up from the individual to our cultural level, and to your point that you made, I mean, they seem like there's so many, not for us to fall into pessimism. We're not going to do that. But there's so many, but I know in some conversations with you that we really talk about, where do we go from here? It's clear that we've got a lot of science behind us. I saw today that they're introducing all these augmented reality, more ways to distract ourselves and go into this different kind of world. But we don't seem to necessarily be all having conversations about some of these fundamental aspects of what it means to be healthy and how we cultivate. And your articulation that you used, Leanne, I think in the book was talking about a new psycho-spiritual system. And I have to wonder, so, we look at where we are in the West. And when I was reading your book, I was thinking, wow, really your focus on Jung is talking so much about our inheritance that we've had, right? Growing up in our dualistic, materialistic society. And, our path forward, can we just adopt yoga? Are people going to do that and just say, well, this is brilliant and this is genius? Do we need to rebrand it into something, or do we need to take some of these aspects of our Western identity that we have and somehow infuse those in a new way? And so when I was reading your book, I really felt that there was that question in there, which is an incredibly powerful question. I just, am I perceiving that right somewhat in your thought process? I think I'm hearing some of your thoughts around, how do we save ourselves? We've got some issues here.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I am not pessimistic myself. And I do think also with the web, like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad, and it's brilliant that, we can communicate to the whole world in the blink of an eye, or the online world in the blink of an eye, which is, pretty incredible. We can be communicating to each other so quickly and broadly these days. Western science is a tool. And I love Dr. Lisa Miller, who runs a lab at Columbia University. And she's basically, I guess, mapped, if you will, the neural correlates of transcendent awareness. That wasn't around in Jung's day. And Jung was all about the religious function of the psyche. So as a Jungian or depth psychologist, I get very excited about looking at that kind of research. She's really clear. Science is a tool, and it's how we show up as scientists and what questions we pose. That's the kind of results we're going to get in a lab. And her neural correlates of transcendent awareness show that, the flip side of that coin is depression, addiction. So you want to have your religious practices, your spiritual practice. It's not about the religion, it's about the practices. It's about the gratitude. It's about the prayer or the meditation or whatever it is within your system, but it's the actual that would be the yoking, the connecting, the line between you and whatever terms you want to use there, higher awareness, source, God, goddess. The term really doesn't matter. It's not the term, it's the relationship. The mind is embodied and it is relational, and it's relational, to us, each other, to the world, and again, to the yogic system of thought. Well, what is reality? It's pure consciousness. So with my system, how am I relating, basically? And again, I think Dr. Miller's research really shows that, through prayer and through that kind of connection, that's how you keep depression at bay or addiction. So I think we can get there in the lab, really. I don't even know if I thought that when I wrote that book, only whatever that was, 8 years ago, 6, 7, 8 years ago. I know it was only published in 2018, but I really started writing it in 2015. But now, Dr. Miller really excited me, for sure. And I do, and affective neuroscience continues to excite me, and the work they're doing with primary process emotions and showing that consciousness is subcortical. It's in the emotional systems of the brain, the limbic system. And I mean, if that's not a nudge to, that it's not all sitting in the cortex and sitting in this constructed system of thought. It's like it's affect. It's coming out of the brainstem, and to me, that's all exciting. And as long as we, interpret correctly or pose the right questions, we can really use our science to keep aiming us towards what I like to call authentic power. That's a term Gary Zukov introduced years ago in his book, The Seat of the Soul. authentic power, because it's the power that's coming from pure consciousness, ultimately, not through a cultural construct of me and you and us and them and, you know, this religion or that religion or this nationality and that. It's like, no, we're one human species and we are sentient amidst a plethora of sentient beings on a very wise and informative earth.
So I have to ask you, because I've seen interesting discussions emerge about this, and it's one of these questions. It's not a fair question for either of us. It's kind of out there, right? But you talking about a multiplicity of beings under this idea of what consciousness is and where we stand potentially with consciousness studies. But some people have really posited these questions about as we look at the emergence of artificial intelligence, and there's a lot of even the people who are creating these systems are finding that the systems themselves they're behaviorally doing things that are often very opaque because of the complexity of it. As you look at Patanjali in your own studies, you know, with this idea that there is a wellspring of consciousness in which everything is arising from, would it be such a radical thing for us? You know, it's hard for me to imagine. My initial thought when you talk about consciousness in some of these systems is to kind of put that on the other side of a partition a little bit. Makes me a little uneasy, to be honest with you. But what are your thoughts when we look at, you know, can we really draw the lines of where we believe consciousness originates and where it doesn't originate? And is that even a right way to look at it?
Back to the Sanskrit, and please, I would not have the best accent. So anybody out there listening,
trying to make me feel better. I appreciate that.
Oh, no, yeah, no, I definitely not. But I believe the term is a jativata, or is it jativada, non-origination, right? So it's eternal and absolute. Again, that ontological primitive is eternal and absolute. So you can maybe find, you know, ish to some degree, you know, the beginning and end point, let's just say, of the body of a Leanne Whitney or something. But ultimately, you know, that system of thought also has past lives. And so really, no, I don't think you would find an origination point. Certainly not ontologically. No. Did I answer the question? Is that where you because I thought you were going to actually ask. I was jumping ahead. I thought you were going to ask about AI or something, like, is AI going to be conscious? Or
yeah, I mean, there are already people who are having some of those discussions about is it feasible that AI could be emergent at some point, that consciousness, without a full understanding of what's requisite for the emergence of consciousness. And it seems to me like in looking at your work and my layman's understanding of anything, but it seems to me in Patanjali and some of these, that there's this panpsychism, that this idea that consciousness permeates absolutely everything. It's, you know, it's from your car, right, to your house. So, you know, when people hear these ideas or feel some of this, you know, hear people talking about artificial intelligence and consciousness, is there a line of delineation that really is defensible from the perception of broader reality?
Now, this is what I think you're asking. I believe, again, pure consciousness sits in itself. There is no other. AI is being generated by human beings. Artificial is there for a reason. There is a coherence. Pure consciousness and the reality of that, it's a very logically consistent, self-defined, self-organizing, I don't know if I want to say structure. Let's just play with these terms for a minute here. But I do want to stick with this idea of coherence and incoherence, or like where in Jungian terms, we look at archetypes and like the shadow archetype, or, you know, evil, right, is live backwards. It's in Patanjali, in his third chapter, once one has mastered concentration, meditation, absorption, one of my favorite sutras, he says, by concentration, meditation, absorption into the heart center, you will come to know the mind. we are given a logically consistent, coherent system of apprehension. And when we split from our heart and we split from the mind body, I think before, therefore I am. No, maybe it's I feel, therefore I am. I intuit, therefore I am. When we split these things off from which ultimately cannot be split, they ultimately cannot be split. You know, there can be dissociation, if you will, but because, again, pure consciousness is the base of everything that flourishes from it, they can ultimately also be linked again. So they never get so far where they're torn because it's non-dual. There is no other. Nothing can ever be outside of reality. It's still all folded within reality. So it can get strained. And I guess you could say that's exactly where we are right now. We're at this incredible place of strain. But when we do these practices, study these texts, a combination of both, you really see, wow, this thing is rotating like the earth, right? She's on her axis and she's rotating around the sun. Like there's a coherence, and evil, or the shadow side of things, really falls into what would be the incoherent category, which ends up being the noise.
Interesting.
And the more we learn how to differentiate the signal from the noise, or the coherent from the incoherent, we are going to be living this thing as human beings in a I want to say a totally different way, or maybe going back to how we were living it, you know, thousands of years ago, or maybe where some cultures do live it today. Because really, I can only speak from the Euro-American culture where I live. But if AI, in other words, is not a tool that's going to serve coherence, it would possibly kill us, because now we're in this incoherent loop. We're up in one of those silos where we think that we have primacy over nature, that we could build something so artificial, when in fact it's the apple and the banana and the pure water that makes our system run. You can't just all of a sudden cut out, you know, the nutrients that make the human being work and then go into this whole artificial schema. That's what I would say.
Service to coherence is a fascinating concept. That's really interesting, the way that you look at that. It made me think of like entropy and some of the conceptions of how coherent systems, you know, can break down and or you know, when energy comes in the system, how that coherence can increase. One of the things I wanted to ask you about a little bit is I know you also, your work is broad, and you in addition to your scholarship, you provide a lot of counseling and therapy services, people who are going through different sorts of challenges and looking at transformation and personal growth. And I also know that you have been an advocate of looking at psychedelics as part of, I would think, probably a practice that's really well thought out, you know, of how those can assist people. And I'm curious on your thoughts of I know that there's 1,000,001 people talking about the benefits of psychedelics, and a lot of fascinating studies that are really reflecting that. But in your own practice, when you talk about psycho-spiritual systems, and how are you seeing some of those benefits be manifest for people that you're assisting? And what do you think are some maybe good ways to approach that, and on the converse, are there ways that really are not well-informed and maybe a little bit hazardous or dangerous?
Oh, undoubtedly that latter, which is why MAPS, the organization MAPS, and probably Johns Hopkins, I mean, probably in all the literature, you're going to find how important set and setting are. Because most of the people who call me because they had really challenging experiences, and they're looking for guidance to interpret it and find their way to the other side of it. So, for sure, set and setting are so important to use of this medicine in a sacred healing way. You know, obviously, any kind of medicine can be used right out at clubs, or right, or abused, or for different reasons. But if people are seeking to take, in particular, psilocybin is the drug I favor. Set and setting is really, really important to that endeavor. I'll speak to my own personal experience, also experiences I've seen people go through, what the medicine did for me. And again, I've seen it do for other people. So I had the pure consciousness event, but I was still not sitting in my body. And though I was practicing yoga and meditation, and it's interesting for me because these things all, the first time I ever did psilocybin was in 2003. I had that pure consciousness event in 2000. So it's not like years went by and I was meditating and whatever. These things are sort of, they all wove together for me. But when I really realized that I could receive the medicine on a really deep, what do I want to, visceral, the way it opened my heart and the way it made my body feel. Now, maybe somebody's going to get that after a yoga practice of however long, but it just sort of accelerated that for me. And again, I don't, there's no recipe here, and that's something Jung would say, like, you can't, there's no way to designate this in the form of a recipe. Everybody's path is going to be different. For me, but I have subsequently worked with people and guided them, especially if people like struggle with a bond with their primary caregiver or with their mom, that this medicine can really hold you and take you into a space of love and profound healing and feeling that kind of unity and love in your body.
It's interesting to me. I think I shared the first time I met you and I ever met. I had I guess a unity of experience after I had begun to have some experience with psychic functioning, and I began to have unusual thoughts that one rarely has, like, what is the nature of time, right? And you start to kind of look around at the world that you've seen before, and you look at it with a little bit of, for me, it was like this funny suspicion. Like, here's a thing presented to me, and I'm not sure that the game's running the way I think it is, right? And that weird thought process led me to, I think you shared with you, like a very unusual experience. And I've only had it once. And so I talked to a lot of my friends who are on the path who've revisited that wonderful place and that I would love to get back to. But do you think, you talk about acceleration? So when we talk about the trajectory of humanity and us trying to broaden our understanding about who we truly are and service to that coherence and service to the world as large, do you think that maybe when we talk about psychedelic medicines, that maybe it has a real potential to help us move parts of, particularly people maybe in the West, towards a position to at least begin to have a totally different perception about where the boundary lines of reality begin and end?
Well, again, if reality is the total, I don't know that you would put a boundary on reality as pure consciousness, but certainly as the conceptions of reality, and you might be speaking to levels of it. I definitely think now is the time. Like, it's so exciting to me, as just as a person, as a healing arts practitioner, that this the moment has come where there's this real resurgence of psychedelic medicine. And again, I don't want to speak for all of them. I have worked with a few of them, and again, maybe every medicine isn't for every person. So, but yes, I absolutely feel, especially psilocybin, they do hold great promise. A great opportunity, let's put it that way. There's a reason why we have the receptors in our brain for this medicine. So, it's beautiful if we, engage with it in a relational way, in a real, with reverence.
I was reading a book. It was by Annie Jacobson called The Phenomenon. She was talking about when the CIA and intelligence agencies began to discover some of these substances, and really was total, no context within the culture about how they're being utilized. No, just like a belief that some of those altered states could have real merit to some of the things that they were pursuing. So it's interesting, the extraction of those practices. And And honestly, looking at some of the things when Patanjali talks about the cities, one of the things that's occurred to me is it seems like in Western tradition, when folks have even recognized that psychic functioning is real, there's been an extraction. People have gone in and kind of taken practices and they've extrapolated them away from the spiritual connotation to talk about what is the utility of this thing that we can do, which to me almost seems like a complete inversion. You talk about, okay, if we do these spiritual practices and we're in alignment to who we really are, suddenly we have the emergence of the ability to perhaps see through time and space. And then you have the idea of like, oh, that's great. We'll come in, we'll appropriate that. We don't need the rest of the stuff. And it's interesting to me. I don't know if you have thoughts on it, but I've talked to several people and I have to wonder, for those of us who are engaged in like psychic work, do we not suffer to some extent? Because when you take away, you take this one slice of something, it feels like it doesn't give us any of the history, tradition, the deep, rich, actual meaning of why you're engaging in these things. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but it seems like there's several instances of that, both with psychedelics and psi practices, where people have really cut part of it out and then left out the rest of the conversation about how these things actually are integrated into who we are.
Yes, undoubtedly that the contingent of people exist. I do think there's also people who do the medicine or do remote viewing and it awakens them into the reality of oneness and maybe they wouldn't call it a pure consciousness event, but they get sort of very unitive experiences. So yes, I definitely think both is happening, and it goes back to perhaps what I was saying about the coherence or the incoherence. So if you do sort of extract it and try to use it, like, let's just say psychic abilities for like black magic or for something more shadow focused, now you're potentially in the evil or the dark again. So now it's going to become incoherent. And in the bigger context of living in alignment with the totality of reality, instead of what you're egoically co-opting that tool or that skill for, to send bad vibes or something destructive out into the world. And Patanjali did warn in chapter 3, where he talks about the cities. He is clear to say the cities should never be sought after just for the sake of it, like, because that's going to also set you back. So for yogis who are, studying the full path, that knowledge definitely would be brought forward to them. Yeah, I don't even want to hang on to the cities, because that's now going to send me into another silo that I'm just going to have to deconstruct at some point.
Egoic issues plus, modest superpowers may not be the most healthy thing to have to get.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
That's so I'm curious what your thoughts are. Is it possible, if you enter in these unitive experiences, and this is a question that I'm going to try. I am going to mispronounce this, but you talk in your book about, I have no idea, Kavala? How do I pronounce this?
Kaivalya. Uh-huh.
You talk about like this Patanjali's pointing to almost this, like a spiritual singularity, right? So this point in which it seems like he doesn't even get into an elucidation, but I think you kind of point to it's almost an invitation to experience, just like an invitation that we see through the practices to begin to see, that the practices hold merit. We can see that things are not that. And I think you have a fundamental point that it's not. You're talking about the evolution of consciousness. That consciousness itself is not changing, but there's a shift that's notable. So when we talk about that, and we talk about Kavala, what are your perceptions about? And is that something that you can arrive at and just stay at? Is it something that there's a sage somewhere that just is existing in this continual state of complete alignment with and full acknowledgement of who they are?
I would say yes, you can rest in it. I don't know. Would that mean that you would have to have all, in his terminology, it would be the samskaras? They would all have to be cleared Yeah, I don't want to say in an ideal world, but yeah.
Some scars are like the idea of would it be from the Indic traditions of like your past lives and things that are carried forward? Is that correct?
Things that are causing the suffering, that are causing the mind to move, and its habit patterns and its imprints is basically what some scars mean. It definitely maps to what Jung would call complexes. And yeah, I think by the time you're at the end of chapter 4, Patanjali is really pointing to that you would have cleared out those imprints of suffering, and you're resting upon yourself. But in those last 5 sutras towards the end of the book, there is some leeway there where you're Dharma mega samadhi, like you're reaching these places of the absorption and samadhi. And if anything comes along, you just go back and do the practices again. So you can really be taking a fairly good, comfortable seat and still have some remaining residue to clear, where you're not really getting thrown off your center. You know what the signals are, the red flags, if you will, or whatever happens in your body. But because you're so far, if you will, along on the yogic path at that point, or so sort of yoked already to the process of yoga, you're in it. You're really, at the end of chapter 1, the Ritambhara Prajna, basically it's the imprint. I say you don't go back from. It's this truth-bearing wisdom. So once you have attained that, you understand it's pure consciousness is the reality, and it's non-dual. And yeah, I really can't speak for, because now what's coming to mind as I say all that is, over and over and over again, people have been disappointed by gurus that come out of India, and, they teach this stuff so well, and then all of a sudden they're sleeping with their students. So yes, I'm sharing what I'm sharing, but I want everybody to you have to keep your discernment. That's maybe one of the teachings that we walk away with, is like the radical discernment. Like you always, yes, trust, but never give your power away. Never. The guru is within. Do not give your power away to a master that's outside. Like, receive the teachings, but just, you have to be aware. Stay aware. Am I projecting onto this master, right? So you're all continually making sure you're doing the work. I hope that's answering your question.
Oh, that was a beautiful cautionary note. If you look at some of the things that have happened, I mean, it reminds me. I'm no scholar in English, but I think in Buddhism there's a saying that's like, you put no head higher than your own. But the idea is like, the teaching is within, that it's your self pursuit. But I always wonder, to your point, like somebody who might sit in that realization continually, I've often wondered, like, would I recognize them? And in my own experience, I had growing up, there was one individual who was not like a preacher or a minister, and he was the gentleman who held the door open. So I grew up in the South, went to this church, but the gentleman who would greet people at the door would emanate a radiance of love, like it wasn't just in his facial expression. It would leave me wondering, like, what is it about this man? It often made me wonder, like, if sages are walking among us, would we know it? Would we see that the coherence and the alignment that they have, and would it be causing that sensation? So I wish I'd been around maybe more enlightened spiritual teachers, but it was quite an experience as a child, just being around somebody who had that palpable brilliance and feeling of just unconditional love that would emanate from him. So you talked about, in that context, I think the heart chakra and the relevance of the heart chakra, and whether or not we purport that the heart chakra exists or not, but that heart and the condition of the heart is something that's really important to our alignment, to be able to understand who we are and have that perception. Is there, as you look at your practices and what your experiences are, I think you talked about breath work being really important to be able to help with that. But is that something you see as absolutely essential to walking the path in Patanjali's philosophy to be able to have that realization?
I do. Concentration and meditation and absorption into the heart center, you come to know the mind. To realize that, to still the mind and be in an open heart. Absolutely essential. And if I could link it again to current day science, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Heart Math Institute out of Northern California. Probably close to the Institute of Noetic Sciences up in that area. Their research, again, speaks to the coherence, to the heart rate variability. And, so I can't maybe rattle off all that they've done at that institute, at the Heart Math, I think it's called Institute, but that's modern day science. That's, I think, also pointing to what Patanjali is speaking to. Drop the mind down, like silence it, drop it down here. Breathe, slow down, really kind of perceive out of this center, and reality can change if that's not the way you know how to go about living. If you're mostly, constructing. But I absolutely do. Compassion isn't a term Patanjali uses. And it is kaivalya. It's not moksha, so it's not liberation. But yes, to rest upon oneself, 100%. That heart center has to be opened, has to be in balance. The breath has to be flowing really well throughout the whole system. Like, there's no way to game the system. That's the genius of what yoga teaches. You will never.
I can't buy a class and just sit down for 30 minutes and it's come on.
Yeah, you can't cheat the system, because the reality, again, it's sitting inside it itself. So your ego goes to co-opt it, something else is going to go offline. And it's that alignment.
So when you think about practices and practice, the concept that this is work, right? It's not something. You have to have dedication to a path. You have to have dedication to, like, as you look at your schedule, like, where have you put time in your life for spiritual refinement, right? I'm kind of reflecting my own struggles sometimes with time management as I look at everything in my life. But, it's interesting to me. You have Patanjali and his prescriptions, and then this is somewhat of a curiosity item for me, but also I think it pertains to maybe some Western ideas. But you also talked about Jung, and Jung had practices. I don't know the complete origin of his. I think it was, you talked about his Black Book, but you had this, I think you talked about it was active imagination. Jung was experimenting to try to develop, maybe, I think you talked about, he wanted almost to develop a yoga system out of Christianity and see that emergence. But what were active imaginations for Jung?
Oh, that's his whole Red Book. And if you haven't ever explored that, it's a total treat. Yes, his whole years, especially after his break with Freud, his confrontations with the unconscious, and his guide, Philemon. And he would, in his dream state but also in these active imaginations, would go and have conversations and gain guidance from his spiritual teacher, Philemon. And there definitely is evidence that Indian teachers have also been taught by gurus who have crossed over. Jung was really excited when he saw that research. He was like, it made him at peace that, oh, wow, I can have a disembodied guide, basically. And again, that's all sort of for Patanjali, all well and good, because again, that's what you could almost say Ishvara is for Patanjali. But Patanjali takes it just a step further into that silence. so that there really is that stilling of the mind, and that those dialogues come to rest upon themselves, that one is satisfied with, if I could say truth with a capital T, and then one comes to rest. And from that resting place, it would be arguable that that's where Tantra kind of comes into yoga. At the end of the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali speaks to Shakti, which is basically a feminine term. So pure consciousness sitting in its true nature. He uses a feminine terminology for that. So you could really argue that's where Tantra meaning not, and again, what we've done in the West with Tantra is, really emphasize the sexual elements of it and the Kama Sutra or whatever. But Patanjali or Tantra really is this unitive. Again, it's just, it's also unitive, but a very embodied unitive, not a otherworldly. It's very much here in this realm, in this body. Eating the peach, making love to your lover. But again, from that very connected state. And yeah, I appreciate what you're saying about that's what I call the vertical connection. And that, everybody who says, oh, I don't have time for my practices, those are the very people, right, who need the practices the most. Like 5 minutes, even if it's just 5 minutes in the morning of a breath practice, something, cat cow or something where you move your body, or some kind of prostration or squats, or something that you do it in a way that's prayerful, if you will. That vertical connection is everything. In yoga, we call it the root to rise. Your feet are planted on the earth, and you're rising also up to whatever term you want to use it, God, goddess, pure consciousness. And then, think about the balance cross, not the Jesus cross, the balance cross. And the horizontal axis is culture, is family, is, and you, without that vertical connection, we're so topsy-turvy on that horizontal axis. So anyway, that's definitely how I.
That's a beautiful teaching. I love that. That's really easy to express to people.
Yeah, that's how I utilize it with my clients, like from day one or whatever, within the first few days, really speaking to the practices and stabilizing that vertical axis.
So you talked about some of the terminology having a feminine connotation, and I'm really interested in that, because I know when we talk about gender, terms get us in trouble, right? So words get us in trouble. They can lead us off different paths. But, oftentimes in certain states of consciousness, particularly of consciousness where you might receive information non-locally, it's a very receptive state. It's not that you're forcing your will. It's not that it's a very, in some ways, it almost feels like a certain humility. And so when we take these different, we can connotate different associations with masculine or feminine. We're using terms, but it seems that differentiation does maybe hold some value. And also it's interesting to me when we talk about the systems that have kind of developed in our non-unitive world, right? Where we're in our materialistic, that oftentimes the feminine, some of the things that connotate feminine in our culture seem like they're very much oppressed, like that there's very much for women and young girls. There's we look at the history of patriarchal society. And do you think there's an intersection point with when we talk about some of the terminology that we use about broader consciousness, and maybe a change of orientation or a change of the admixture of two energies inside of individuals?
I agree that language is important and that we can get tripped up by it. Boy, what just came to me as you said that was, like, if you think about the silo as the masculine and then the feminine as the receiving, as it's being brought down. So the penetration and the receptivity, that just came to me as you were speaking. I think our culture is in need of a heavy dose of balance towards the feminine and what the respect for earth, our intuitive capacities, beyond our intuitive capacities, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, and that's all receptive, like you're saying. There's a silence, there's a unity with, it's the essence of to be. So yeah, I hope I'm getting towards your question there, but yeah, we definitely have a need for sure of balancing both. I don't want to get too technical, and I don't even know that I can clearly speak to the brain science to it. But if you think about left hemisphere as this logical, linear, linguistic, whereas the right hemisphere and all the sort of implicit knowings come up from the body up into the right hemisphere. It's pointing to that receptivity that you're talking about. Like neuroception is happening in our body 24/7. Our organs are, talking to each other, if you will, and sending 80% of that information goes up into the brain. The brain only sends 20% of the information of motor coordination back down into the body. So we truly want to be receptive to a vast amount of material that we have completely cut ourselves off from. And again, matter, mat, feminine. So I do think there is, when you break the language down, you can see these, the terminology in gender. Again, it's not my specialty, but when I look at it, I can see it.
Interesting.
I do this because I'm often talking about cauldron, the alchemical cauldron. So that's kind of what I'm meaning when I make that gesture. We're going to drop it in the cauldron.
I know that our gender constructs, talk about growing up in the South. For me, the constructs that I was handed about my identity that I'm incarnated in had a lot of things that seemed to definitely not be very useful to me in terms of understanding this side of quieting the mind, of being receptive, as opposed to what's celebrated sometimes in those cultural perceptions about masculinity. So it's interesting to me if we think about to your point about trying to bring forth a greater coherence, and more realization about what to move people towards a greater realization of self and greater alignment with the individuation of broad consciousness, whatever term we want to use, to our individual consciousnesses. It's interesting for me to imagine what that society would be like. And hard too, because we've lived in this kind of our world is so upside down, it feels like, in a lot of different ways. You're the optimist. I'm going back into pessimism. I apologize. I'll do better. That's why I'm asking your advice and asking you questions.
Well, a colleague of mine, Dan Levine, out of University of Texas, Arlington, wrote a book. The title's eluding me, but basically we need emotion to make rational decisions. And what I feel like I hear you're pointing to is this phenomena of big boys don't cry, or man up, or the fact that human emotion wasn't even studied until the 1990s or 1980s, even in the Euro-American culture.
I had no idea. That's amazing. That's incredible.
Yes. So it just shows you the dry period that we had. Emotions were seen to be so sort of superfluous. Now, Jung would have never said that. Patanjali for sure would have never said it. They both point to affects, positive and negative affect, as coding for particular human experiences. So again, to where the fact that yoga philosophy and psychology is marginalized in our culture and seen as some sort of, esoteric, Indian thing, versus in Jung for sure has been marginalized. But now, like with my colleague, Dan Levine, and then there's been some also very famous books that have been written within the past couple decades that are full in affective neuroscience. So again, we see the movement forward, but yeah, you cannot make a truly rational decision if your rationality is cut off. in supposedly separate, supreme way of being. I don't know if you've ever seen the hand model of the brain, but the neocortex, the cortex is sitting on top of the limbic system, which sits on top of the brain stem, which then, falls right into the spinal cord. We need the whole apparatus to be integrated and running in this integrated way in order to really make logically consistent and truly rational decisions.
So it's not good just to isolate one part of ourselves and then proceed forward like we're okay. Learning as we go. That's awesome. I wanted to ask you, so this kind of draws upon conversations I've had with others, and curious if you had thoughts on this in the context of your own experience and your scholarship. But certainly it seems like when people begin to follow some of the paths that you allude to, when they really dedicate themselves to the idea of a spiritual refinement, and quite honestly, in my own experience, just doing whatever we say psychic psi stuff is, that you begin to have, we talk about synchronicities of these other experiences, they begin to increase, like the frequency of some of these things that challenge our perception, a very limited perception, a reality box of what we think, is contained inside that. It seems like it's not just one thing, that there seems to be several things that sometimes occur when that happens. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on why that is. Is it built into the system? Is it part of, is the universe reaching its arms out to us? It gave us one experience that led us to the path to, sometimes it feels like there is some timing to it. So you might have something that happened and you think, I really don't understand how the world works. And then you might kind of fall away from that perception. And then something else happens that kind of brings you back to it. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about.
Well, I would say that when we are, let's just say, in the incoherent bubble, that's all running synchronistically too, but there's just so much noise, you won't perceive what the simultaneity of those events are. Versus when we're in the coherence, now the heart is open and there is a sense of harmony and receptivity. And so then the music just starts to take a different tenor and tone. And it's the beauty of the synchronicity. And so our minds play it up a little bit more. But I would say the synchronicity is ultimately happening at every level. It's the disharmony versus the harmony, which makes the synchronicity really come alive. So when we're in harmony and at one with the universe, or feeling our heart open, feeling receptivity, then the synchronicity is like, oh, it's delicious that everything's working in this way, versus the disharmony with
so
the.
if I'm understanding you correctly, it's really, these things are continually occurring, but when we have this harmony and alignment in ourselves, the if you will, the reverberation of the synchronicity, the import of the synchronicity becomes very different to us because we are in a very different position in relationship to it. Is that kind of how you?
100%. It's like, an orchestra playing on key or not. In that, that dissonance or incoherence, noise. It's one particular experience versus the on-key harmony. Synchronistic feels a little bit, feels very different, basically. Jung said one time, everything is happening simultaneously in the mind of God, or, it's that idea that it's the block universe, if you will, the past and the present. I mean, and this from remote viewing, it's like, everything's here. And again, whether it's just all the many possibilities or firmly created futures, but the oak is in the acorn, so to speak.
So Lynn, do you feel like we are at the inflection point? You talk about excitement, and the I think when you wrote your book, you were talking about maybe when it comes to cognitive science and how that at one point maybe there wasn't as much of a multidisciplinary approach. And I'm not in that realm. I don't know how you feel about things, but when you talk to your colleagues, your book years ago, you were talking about remote viewing and acknowledgement of that reality. you were talking about unitive experience. In your book, you talk about the emerging scientific research about reincarnation. And I think some people talk about, I've heard people reference Carl Sagan in this context. So like Sagan's said, like the two things that are still worth exploring, or was reincarnation and psi. But do you feel like that we're maybe at a point where in your sphere, with your conversation with your colleagues and researchers and folks who are doing that scholarship, that has the context of the conversation changed? Are you feeling hopeful that that questions are beginning to emerge, and that the very orthodox kind of structure around scientific materialism, does it feel like that facade to you is beginning to be a little less reinforced?
I wish I could say yes across the board. I mean, it definitely is in certain areas, but there are some hardcore orthodox scientists who just won't budge. But yeah, I would say over the course of over the past 2 decades in my academic career, either I wasn't exposed to or it has flourished. I do see that, kind of like what I'm saying, Dr. Lisa Miller out of Columbia. I mean, all the amazing work that Dean Radin continues to produce out of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. The conference on consciousness that the University of Arizona runs every year. So many inspiring things come out of that conference every year. So yeah, I definitely think there's reason for hope, and I do. Yeah. Is it? I don't know. I don't. There's so many of us on the planet. Like we've ballooned to how many? 8 billion. Even though they say there's going to be a population contraction at some point, but there's a lot of us. So proportionally, I don't know what those proportions are, because there definitely are in the Euro-American culture. There's still some really hardcore orthodox scientists, if we could call them that. But I also see people really, making headway for sure in the fields of parapsychology and affective neuroscience, spirituality in the case of Lisa Miller. So yeah, I think we've got some yummy stuff going on for sure.
I like that articulation, yummy stuff. That's pretty good. What would your advice be, Leanne? So if you look at, you had this unitive experience that set you off and on the course, as you sound like it radically changed your orientation and trajectory in life. I know many people might hear that and want to have that experience themselves. So, but also in my humble experience, when I first read Patanjali, I read it with a lot of commentary. And then I realized, like, I'm mostly spending my time in the commentary. And when I came back after reading your text, I went back to Patanjali and I was like, this is not beginner stuff. Like, Patanjali is complex. Not necessarily maybe the practices are complex, but Patanjali doesn't seem like just like an entry level sort of, maybe not the first text. So for people who want to maybe look at Patanjali or embrace some of these practices, there's so many diverse schools of yoga. And where would you recommend that people kind of orient themselves if they were interested in developing themselves in this way?
I love that you brought up, there are so many diverse schools of yoga for sure. Bhakti, Jnana, Karma, Raja Yoga is Patanjali's yoga. Bhakti is the yoga of the heart, that's singing, kirtan. Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, which is the study of the texts as well. Karma Yoga is acts in the world, service. And they all work beautifully. And there's also, obviously, in this country, lots of different yoga schools for asana practice. At the heart, pranayama, or the breath work, to me is a great entry point. And questions, we could, I guess, leave your viewership with a few key points. It's like key basic questions. The amygdala is in the brainstem, like they're coding from really, really early on. It's patterns. And the core pattern is trust, don't trust, safe, unsafe. And so for people to ask themselves, just really radically, or reflectively, radically on, and being really radically honest, do I feel safe? Do I trust? If that answer is yes, there's a stable foundation there. If that answer is no, then one has to really, really begin with the breath work to become safe and comfortable within one's own body. And again, depending upon where that person's located, are they in a safe house? Are they in a safe community? Like, find safe spaces, find safe people, find safe communities, because this is about relationship. Like, we have to bond with each other. We have to learn how to trust each other. We have to build communities where we can be in our bodies and feel safe and not feel like we're constantly running from the fraud and the lies. And part of yoga, that deep philosophical basis, is ethics. It's nonviolence. It's truth. It's non-greed, non-stealing. That's the first limb of Patanjali's path. So I would say that's the first question for people to really ask themselves. Do I feel safe? Was I born into a family that allowed me to come into my body and feel safe? Did they usher me into the culture and into the collective in a way to feel safe? And to the degree that those answers are yes, how are you serving the world? What is your alignment into, your authenticity and how you serve the world through, mothering children, or, whatever career, whatever we're doing, because our jobs all build the social structure and the social fabric. So what jobs are we choosing is really, especially in a capitalistic society, every dollar we spend, every job we choose, we are building the culture. Do we want a safe one or not safe one? And we have to keep trying to massage that. And especially in a democracy where we can vote people into office, it becomes very sort of social justice oriented in a way, because that's the bodhisattva, or that's the idea of a yogi. It's not just about sitting on a mountaintop. It's here being in the world. So I don't know if that's the answer that you're looking for, but it's that breath work and that safety is really, really the foundation. Because without that, you don't yet have a stable base to really root down in. So that's the first, the first basic line is right there.
So you're down the road, having walked the path, and to me it feels like the path sometimes it gets narrower as the further you go. So I have a lot of respect when I talk to people. Usually you say like thank you for sharing your wisdom, and the wise people say, oh, I'm not wise. But it seems to me too, the thing I really appreciated in your book was even just highlighting the commonality that Jung and Patañjali had about, if you're feeling certain feelings, that these are red flags. If you have this realization in some way. And so, I try in my practice, if I feel kind of down, if I don't feel right, if I don't feel safe, to your point, but also like, you talked about fear, like a fearful feeling about things. So, in my burgeoning practice of trying to be less ignorant, but I really, that's helped me a lot to be able to be considerably more thoughtful that maybe those things are not meant to be normative, right? If I was really aligned to who I am, should I be always encountering some of these things or patterns of those things, right?
Right.
So,
fear is built into the hardware. We want it. You want to be able to. This morning I bumped into a coyote in the middle of my city, like, and I had my dog with me. Like, I want to protect her. And
That's a good fear.
yeah, I took her into like the archway of somebody's home and tried to like hide as I watched the coyote sort of look around. So yeah, absolutely, you're in a crosswalk and a car starts barreling at you. You want to be able to like get to the other side. Like, fear is built into the hardware. It's a primary process part of the brain. We want it. We don't want to live there. Anger has its place. Rage has its place. You don't want to live there. Panic, grief, distress have their place. The depression, it shows us the separation. Depression is really correlated to that panic, grief, distress line in affective neuroscience. So yeah, it's a red flag. It's an indicator. We want to be able to read it and interpret it and move our energy along lines that are in service to our authenticity and our authentic power. The culture, especially the biopharmaceutical model, and that's not to say that medicines don't have their place at a particular time, but to numb a culture out through medicine, I don't believe, as a depth psychologist, is the answer by any stretch of the word, or as a yogi.
Experience with antidepressants in my family have not been the best thing, right? In terms of long-term solutions to certain things. So I like your note on fear having its particular place. One time I went out and I thought, this is where you get these big ideas about your spiritual practice. And so I went out in the woods to meditate at night by a waterfall. So I was deep in the woods all by myself. And so I was like, this is a really neat thing. I'm out here doing this sense of isolation. My ideas about, what one would do when you're following this path. And I did get into a very meditative state. But when I came out of it, I was so in a different state. I actually walked up on a bear mama and her cubs. And it was really interesting because I don't think I would have actually gotten that close to it. I don't think I felt like humans normally do, right? It's a kind of a funny thing to say, but she kind of looked at me sideways. Like, so I started to feel the balance point between this equanimity and like feeling my, unity with things, and also being very careful that I don't just like shake hands with a bear. But I managed to survive that one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So not a fair question to you at all, but I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your scholarship. Also, I noted, I think your work is obviously oriented in an academic orientation, but I did note your footnote. I mean, that what you're talking about here with your path and the work that you've done has a direct correlation to your own spiritual path and some of the things that you've walked through. And so as you look at where we are now and some of the challenges, people talk about always one megalomaniacal leader away from, a nuclear war, or you look at the environment, and we're all, it seems like we're trying to find some solution to sustain us forward. And so rather than this externalized view of like the new technology that's going to fix these problems, or your work to me really speaks of that involution, right? Of going back to the source, of not that focus of the external, not the egoic knowledge, but really going to the heart of wisdom and going back to these beautiful scientific yogic traditions that sustained people for quite some time. So if you look at where we are, how do we save the world, Leanne? So this small for you.
Small question.
But if you look, I think you touched upon this, like people who have these experiences, it leads them in this path. So is that the key element? Like, do we need to be able to bring people more to those experiences that Jung avoided, where he didn't want to do the yogic practices? Or, what is the prescription to, I'm sure you have this solution, right?
Well, I would say this. I don't have fear of death. I think that's one thing that maybe the pure consciousness event, but also, long-term meditation practice. I would say a couple things. I would refine the question. We don't need to save the world. We need to save humanity, if anything. We need to save the species, possibly. But the earth is going to be fine. She'll shake us off. She's got her own lifespan. She's got beautiful, beautiful, amazing creatures. I mean, there's one more gorgeous than the next. Like, whew, it makes me emotional, actually. She's all set. We don't have to save her. We have to save ourselves from polluting her and killing our own habitat. I mean, any species that pollutes their habitat, their water supply and everything, like, how intelligent do we really think that we are? Like, that's the reality check. Yeah. How do we go about doing that? Yeah, as a yogi and a Jungian, I do think it's person by person, in the sense that we all have to be reflective. We all have to be aware of our own shadow. In particular, am I acting out of fear or not? Because again, fear is the thing that throws the interference patterns big time. Am I in my heart center and, open, able to live in love? Or am I really afraid, unnecessarily so? It's one thing, again, with caution around a coyote or a truck barreling at you. Those are appropriate places for fear. But are we chronically living from fear? Has the culture created that? Does the culture feed that? Is that where the culture wants us? Then we each have to do our job to become strong, authentically empowered, and create a different culture. The world is made up of communities of people. And so really, that's where the salvation lies, is in each of us desiring and having the vision of something different. We have to be able to see it. And again, if we live in fear, it's very hard to visualize it. But when we're in love, we have living in love, when we have loving people in our family, loving pets, then you can start to feel it. You can start to visualize it, and you move out into the community. And, if your community isn't already that, but that, to me, that's where what we want. That would be my answer to your very deep.
I don't think I've asked any well-formed or deep questions, but I do, you remind me of like a drop of water, the ripple, starting in yourself, starting in your family, the ripple to your community. And then, and of course, I asked for the simple answer, right? Where's the easy button that we can press? And, but I love your perspective too. It's very different to think about. You're like, save humanity or there's all this, if you look at the change of the earth and the constant emergence and decline of different species, and it's a very different perspective sometimes when you're perhaps not clinging to the frame of humanity either. But it's a deep wisdom. It's a harder one for me to swim in the deep waters with you on that one. But Leanne, I really appreciate. Thank you so much for all your work. Thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom. I want to mention you also have, I think, some classes that you're teaching. I saw, I don't know if you want to mention, but if folks want to find out more about some of your work and some of your books, what's the best way for them to?
Well, definitely to come to my website. I'm not enrolling in any classes at the moment, but I am in development of several. Actually, next year, I'm going to launch a coaching program. It'll be a 2-year program to train people on transformational coaching. And so my website, signing up for my email address and entering your email address and signing up from my newsletter, which I only send a few a year, but that would keep somebody up to date with what offerings I have, if there's any retreats or whatever classes or programs I have. That's the best way.
And so, I'm going to start my campaign to get people to convince you to finish the third act it sounds amazing. So we're going to get a group together and send our bulk email to you every now and again. But
yeah, to get us to do it. And hey, this gratitude goes both ways. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and the work that you're doing in particular with the remote viewing and using your skills for that, and your own wisdom and inquisitiveness, and your willingness to share. And it's beautiful. So,
well, I think you touched upon talking about community, but the group of folks who are in the remote viewing are just amazing individuals in what they share, and the knowledge and also their inquisitiveness. So certainly that group has a lot of insight that's sometimes useful. So But Leanne, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your wisdom, and I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Let's see, how do I stop this thing? This is the part we'll edit out.